And good morning and many thanks for watching KTN News. Welcome back to Morning Prime today as we talk about Kenya at 60. Where are we 60 years later? Is the country better? Is the country moving in the right direction? What do we need to fix? That is the conversation I am having today. In studio with me is Nerima Wako, Executive Director, Siasa Place, and joining us digitally via Zoom is Kevin Osido, Executive Director, County Watch Forum. Now, Nerima, let me start with you. Yeah, the president said a lot during his speech, and that includes the fact that for everyone who's coming to the country, there is no need of them having visa. What's the importance of him going this direction, and how will Kenya benefit from that? And while we're talking about it, how do we ensure that we, as we treat others, we are treated the same way? Yeah.
That's a very good question because I believe that the president is fulfilling an agreement that the country made. Under Agenda 2063, our states basically made a promise of interconnectedness. So opening up the borders is not a specific idea of President William Ruto, but it is something that he has been mandated to come forth. And so many other countries are going to be opening their borders. We have seen Rwanda working on it, we have seen Senegal, we have seen Ghana as well. So we are not the first African country to say that we want to open up our borders. I do think it's a step in the right direction. I do hope that it's more Pan-African. A lot of times when we say open up the borders, we focus heavily on tourism coming from the global north or from Europe, from Western countries, because we feel that they bring more in terms of the economy and they pump more resources in terms of tourism. I do believe that we ourselves as Africans can also support our economies locally, domestically, and even Kenyans ourselves. We don't even know Uganda. You know, we can also travel to Tembe. We know Tanzania. So it would also free up that process. But you raise a very valuable question. You know, as much as we're opening it up for visa-free, are they doing the same for us? You know, when we look at the news, even in the West, UK is having even more stricter regulations when it comes to work permits. As much as the president has been pushing for bilateral agreements, we're seeing that they're saying you can have workers come to our countries, there are opportunities, but they cannot come with their families. So we are seeing a pushback, especially when we look at the elections that are happening in Europe. We're seeing a lot of populist parties coming to the fore and rising, and they're rising based on immigration. So immigration is going to be a discussion that's going to be very valuable in the next decade, in the next 5 years even, where our continent is looking at, since everywhere else is shutting us out, how can we welcome our own, and what would that look like? So for me, for someone who does travel a lot, I'm happy to hear that, you know, Kenya is opening it up, but I hope that as a Kenyan, I'm treated as kindly when I travel to other countries as well. I think it will bring about, hopefully, opportunities of not just business, also culture, and pushing for more prosperity, not just for the country and for the region as well.
Now let me talk to Kevin. Kevin, now it is 60 years, you say you're confused. First of all, why are you confused? And second of all, as we still talk about issues to do with visa-free Kenya, how does that sit with you? And you're also someone who travels a lot. When you travel, how do we make sure that this conversation is also absorbed out there such that whilst others are getting in, it's easier for them. Also, when we go out, it's easier for us. I mean, going to Uganda should not be a tough job.
Interesting, really interesting, Dennis. And it's interesting to me because if you asked someone who was born 60 years ago what visa-free entry into Kenya means to them, I think there's probably going to be
I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, I think that there's probably going to be a bit of a challenge for them to understand why the visa-free policy is coming up. But I am glad because truth is that the world is growing in a very fast way, and the globe is indeed becoming a small village, and people are getting connected in one way or another, particularly given issues around the internet and digitization and all that. But truth again is that people still have to travel. And when you travel from one country to another, there has to be a mechanism through which you are not only registered, but indeed acknowledged to have visited a country. And that really is a mechanism through either a passport or a visa. And I think for me, 60 years down the line, if you asked a Kenyan in the village, like where I am right now, that policy to them brings in some certain dents. And part of those dents is indeed the fact that, one, you have challenges acquiring a passport. So how are you supposed to travel? Locally, the cost of getting the passport or that document for travel has been increased. And this is why I say for us, or for me, 60 years down the line is a little bit confusing. Number three to that, Dennis, is currently in Africa, we are talking about Africa Renaissance, a rebirth of the continent. What does that mean to Africans? What does that mean to us as Kenyans, and particularly a country that is really primed to be one of the big four in Africa? And so for me, as the president is talking about visa-free entry and the aspiration around making Kenyans feel part and parcel of the global village, further concerns continue to come up 60 years down the line. For instance, tourism. What does that mean to us insofar as tourism is concerned? What does it mean for young people who probably are looking for jobs against those who come into our country, either as visiting expats or expatriates, or people who are basically coming to get jobs in Kenya? Much more fundamental question still borders around the facilitative tool of travel. For instance, our airports. Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, 60 years down the line, with the kind of stories that we see, honestly, power blackouts with no working generators. Sometimes it is raining and the roofs are leaking. If you ask someone who was born 60 years down the line that question today, I think their response would be almost similar to mine, confusing. But indeed, it's a good thing. I believe that what we need to ask the president and the people who engage in this kind of policy frameworks is, what is the value for the policy? Does it make sense to us as a country? Is there value that is accruing from these kind of policies that are being made by His Excellency the President?
Thank you very much, Kevin. And he raises some very pertinent questions. Now, even traveling just in the country, to leave this country to start with, you need to get a passport. For you to get a passport, you might probably spend close to even 5 months just waiting for that passport. Yes. You know, and these are issues that even as we open our borders, let's make it easier for our people to travel. Let them have these travel documents. I will give you my personal experience. I camped at Nyayo House not long ago, and when I got my passport, I was like, finally, alhamdulillah, I have I have my passport. And see, when you go there, it is throngs of people at Nyayo House trying to get this document. So even as you're opening our country for people to get in, how are we empowering our people to also travel, to see this world and be able to come back and contribute in building this nation based off what they've seen out there that is different?
I remember even the time that, Esther Kazungu had put up how she was spending an anniversary of waiting to get her passport. And it's just, you even get worried in terms of, am I even going to ever get this passport? And I agree with Kevin completely in terms of how difficult it is to attain one, and how a lot of young people, you have to be able to migrate to look for opportunities because they're just not enough around you. But I do think we are past the bridge on, is this policy going to support the Kenyan people, and what do we do about it? And, I mentioned it in my open remarks that we have already, as a country, agreed to open our borders. That was done. And this is something that it was even done by President Uhuru Kenyatta. It's the free movement protocol. Free movement protocol is going to happen. It is happening. And our heads of states have already said that we're going to open the borders. And I do agree that there's a lot of work that does need to be done in terms of the infrastructure that is available. So in connection to that, even if we're talking about traveling physically, from that feedback, what I was hearing had a lot to do with tourism. When we're talking about business, there are a lot of bilateral agreements that are occurring right now, and also the push for a digital economy and in terms of work. There are a lot of questions that haven't been answered. There are people right now who are based in Kenya, but they are working for a company in Ireland or in the US or in Canada. They are not necessarily physically traveling there. And these are the conversations that I'm seeing a lot of Western countries having. And they are moving toward, are we still able to support one another in terms of business without the physical transportation of an individual? Even the whole conversation around passports is going to change. You know, we're seeing our passports currently, the East Africa community, they are light blue because of that. Integration. That's why you need that new one where you're able to scan the biodata at the back of your passport. That's what we have moved to. But the next step our governments are going to move to completely digital. They're experimenting even with your eye in terms of that information. Yes. And this is something that is already started in terms of testing. Are we going to be able to have passports that are not necessarily paper documents? And I agree, because there are a lot of issues even internally in terms of citizenship. What does citizenship mean? And even when we talk about integration, we talk about the Africa Free Trade Area in terms of business. What will it mean for citizens of different African countries to be able to travel and start businesses? So in a nutshell, there are a lot of issues that do need to be resolved. Government has been working very slowly in terms of passport control in Nairobi. There have been reports of them trying to buy new machines and putting new machines in new counties. They added Kisii, they added Nyeri, they added Kisumu. But I don't know if that's going to reduce the pressure that it has put in Nairobi fast enough. I don't know if people are going to be able to receive their passports fast enough. This is something that happened within the last 4 weeks. So I do hope that we are able to have these documents accessible to all people. Because again, when they become expensive, like Kevin has mentioned, it's only accessible to a certain class. We want this to be accessible to all citizens, to be able to have access to all opportunities for all Kenyan people.
And I come to you, Kevin, now. It is a question of citizens being able to move, but even let's talk about the African context. It is a question of for you to go to a country within Africa is difficult than going to a place like Dubai, you know. And how then do we as Africans speak in one voice, in unison, and say, we are Africans, we can trade with ourselves. I don't need to get outside Africa to go enjoy some tall buildings in a different continent. I could go down South Africa and enjoy that. If someone wants to see, I don't have to leave Kenya to go to a zoo in the US to see a giraffe. I can, you know. So it is about Africans speaking this in one unison voice to be able to have business, to embrace culture, to enhance internal tourism in Africa. How do we have that conversation as African leaders, and what do you propose that, how do you propose this conversation starts being held, Kevin?
That is a very good question. And as I said earlier on, the question around African Renaissance and the rebirth around what needs to work in Africa is already ongoing. The challenge that I think is a problem, the challenge which is a problem to us, I think, is the issue around privatization. Because, for instance, look at the conversation around climate change that Kenya and Nairobi hosted. Very good conversation, very properly attended, despite a few or some African countries that are considered quite superpowers locally missing. A conversation that is relevant to issues that are affecting Africa. But the question then that would beg is, climate change, yes, a very good priority, but beyond that very high level conversation, so what? Does it resonate to the locals? Do they feel the impact of not climate change, but indeed the impact of those very high-level conversations. When policies are made, when legislations are passed to be able to, enhance and strengthen climate change adaptation response, disaster mitigation and all that, do those policies really and those frameworks focus on the common mwananchi down there, the person who really feels the impact of climate change? So I'm using this really to border on even the question around economy, business and all that. And I agree with Nerima that the world is changing and we are focusing currently on business process outsourcing. But for me, Dennis, the question would still be, as local as African, to ask ourselves, for how many expatriates that come to Kenya from whichever country, African country, do we have young people being invited as exchange? If we have experts coming to work for the UN in Kenya, for instance, yes, of course, it's for the UN, but partly it is our country that is supposed to benefit because of other extended infrastructural and logistical processes that are related. For instance, housing, for instance, roads, for instance, access to water, for instance, health and all that. And so when the president, for example, goes to another African country or even a country outside there and says, I am going to bring back jobs, do we really get back to validate and evaluate the number of jobs that he has brought back and the number of young people who will then benefit from these opportunities that the president or whoever it is that is representing our country is talking about? So I think for me, African leaders will begin to have a conversation that has already been had in the second Renaissance around even no visa-free Africa, where you don't have to be validated from the opportunity that you have to have a document that shows which country you come from, which African countries you come from, and then you ask, where are you going to stay? For how long are you coming here? Who is going to be your host? Those are questions which to me sometimes, Dennis, really do not border on the primary reason as to why Africa is supposed to be connected. And looking at the next 18 years, we are talking about 2030, 6 years. And of course, we're also talking about Africa Agenda 2063. Where does that leave us as Africans insofar as looking at the youth bulge that is coming up of the leadership that we have today? What kind of conversations are young people who are going to be the African leaders of tomorrow, indeed partners of development today, going to be having about Africa when that time comes? And so I think for me, the questions around Kenya's 60th birthday and Africa's, and if you look at a number of African countries, indeed, that also got independence like we did around about the same time, the kind of concerns that we are having today also belabor them. They also trouble them. They also disturb them. But if you look at the kind of conversations we are having as African leaders, sometimes they are conversations that I think for me do not prioritize the issues indeed that Africans are facing. And so for instance, locally, we're talking about Lapset, and it's a road that is supposed to connect us all the way from Somalia to South Sudan. And it's traversing almost 20 plus counties of Kenya. And so you ask yourself, Dennis, what is the value for such a huge African infrastructural project to go through Kenya if it is not helping the locals? And so the question then is, to what level of conversation are our leaders having at that high level to be able to augment the challenges that Africans are facing? I rarely disagree with Nerima, but I tend to disagree that we can as well open so many offices for us to be able to enhance passport acquisition. But if it is not in the best interest of the government to put Kenyans at the forefront of opportunities, then whether we open every office in every county for Kenyans to go and access passports, it will not be helpful to us. Why I say this is because you look at the migration crisis that we have in South America, even in the Middle East. The number of young people who are seeking for opportunities outside Africa and therefore losing their lives. Sometimes they are young people who cannot be traced by their families. Look at, for instance, even locally in our social media platforms, the number of reports that we see people saying, oh, my relative went to this country gone astray. See the number of bodies that we receive almost every year, Dennis, of Kenyans who are being brought back to the country, having run out there to go and look for opportunities. So I think for me, the conversation around Africa's opportune moment and Africa's renaissance around what the global community is talking about and highlighting the place of Africa, where, for instance, we are talking about natural resources, we are talking about oil and gas, we are talking about minerals, we are talking about just what Africa has to sell to the world. At what point do our leaders consider those as huge opportunities that are indeed worth an exchange for profits, for benefits, especially for Africans in the African continent? Dennis.
Yes, Nerima, you want to respond to?
Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out where Kevin and I have disagreed. You know, he said there's a point, he rarely disagrees with me, but I was trying to hear, because I feel like we're on the same page, but maybe, Kevin, you can say it over, because it's not that I'm saying that the opportunities are there. They are not. The things that you have raised, I've agreed with you. But also the consequences. I mean, I do work with youth. And even when we look at the continent itself, the World Bank said in their most recent report that you would need 230 million jobs to cater for the youth population that we have. When we have 30% of the global population being young people from Africa, the countries are just not going to be able to produce enough opportunities for the population that they have. Our country, the average age is 19. In Germany, it's 41. So you can see the gaps that exist. And I do agree with you completely in terms of a lot more needs to be done. That we're on the same page with. But I've not understood where
I think
it
was alluding the fact that even if we open a lot of offices out there to get passports, if the government does not have the interest of people, those offices would not deliver as expected. But let's move away from issues to do with visas and Kenya opening up, and let's go to the inflation. And according to the standard that is on page 2, it still talks on the same, and I'll just quote what the president says. And together we have made the right choices, sometimes taken very difficult and painful decisions to steer Kenya back from the edge of catastrophic cliff of debt distress and move our nation in a new direction. The president says that 6.8% current inflation rate, down from a high of 9.2% last year. In the last 6 months, GDP has grown at 5.4%, making Kenya 29th fastest growing economy globally. The inflation has gone down according to the president. Do Kenyans feel the same in their pockets?
No, we don't feel the same. Even just reading the numbers, it was surprising to see that inflation has gone down. Things do feel a lot more expensive. They are a lot more expensive. And so I know, you know, even in Kevin's introduction, he said, you know, numbers don't lie. So it's a rude shock. I can say that even because the fact that we're in December and we'll be going for holidays, there are a lot of people who are not traveling, including myself. So yeah, you too. You see, so that should even be a very simple statistic as to, you know, why have the numbers gone down? Because I'm pretty sure they have. So that shows you just how people are struggling with the high cost of living. So, yeah.
And even when you talk about the high cost of living in the president's speech, I didn't hear him say the cost of unga has gone down. I mean, that has always been a line for the president whenever he addresses the nation. But that was nowhere to be seen. But Kevin, when we talk about issues to do with the cost of living and inflation rate going down, Kenyans every day raise concerns with regard to that. Where do you stand with the president's statement yesterday on the cost of living and inflation?
You see, Dennis, the president's numbers sometimes lie. Those numbers don't lie. and I don't know where our very beloved president gets his numbers from, because honestly, if you listen to some of the remarks that were made barely a few days or weeks ago by Treasury and some of the people who handle his our finances, they told us that the government does not have money. And they indeed went further and told us that even certain essential services cannot be provided the biggest question has been going on around here about the lack of resources to even support CDF. And you look at, despite the challenges with CDF, but the opportunities that locals have when it comes to constituency development fund and the opportunities that come with the government resources. And so when the president says one thing and Treasury says another thing, I think there's probably a confusion. And so 60 years down the line for me is still confusing. And so the president, in my view, needs to really listen to some of his very good brains in the various government agencies, particularly Treasury, Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, with the kind of data that they have, issues around cost of living. Every corner of this country, people are grappling with just putting food on the table without necessarily even going to begin to talk about what will happen in January 2024 when schools open. So you talk about debt distress, but the president has not told us, for instance, what is happening with our debt register, which has been the biggest call. In fact, in almost all his speeches, I am sure that that particular paragraph is always put somehow. But why we never get to listen to commitments by our president addressing the nation over some of these very fundamental issues, I think is a big concern. We are talking about debt distress, and we are aware about reports of monies that have been stuck in some countries out there. What is the level of repatriated resources that have been brought back to Kenya? Can we be given some feedback around who took them there? What action is being taken? What is the commitment of Kenya Kwanza government on corruption and people who are, stifling our resources and using them for reasons or for ways that are not citizen-centric? What is the level of repatriating these resources back to the country? How many corruption cases that have really made us talk about debt for Kenya have been successful? What is the level of these cases? How much do we anticipate to get to be able to repay our debt? And so talking about corruption and debt repayment, how far have we paid our debt? I remember Senator Mtata sometimes ago telling us that, by the way, Kenya has already paid its debt. So the president is proper to be able to give us a national direction, but I think sometimes some of the opinion that some of the things that the president talks about are either far-fetched or things that, as Kenyans say, indeed present a mechanism of veto kwa ground ni tofauti, because you can't be talking about us, bringing down the inflation level to 9.2% when a majority of Kenyans don't even have resources. We're talking about the possibility of moving from one town to another, and the cost of fuel, cost of diesel, cost of petrol. That paragraph, Dennis, to me, would have probably presented something much more meaningful to Kenyans to be able to provide hope in the kind of hopeless context that Kenyans are finding themselves in. It's good that the president spoke about debt distress, but I want to believe that a lot of work still needs to be done to answer to so many questions that Kenyans are asking about our state of debt.
Now, about 60 years later, and the country is dealing with corruption levels we've never experienced before. I mean, even right now, there's the question of the edible oil that was brought into this country. KEBS once telling us it is not fit for human consumption. The other day, they're reviewing the statement telling us, actually, we can now review it because of vitamin levels is neither here nor there now. We also have the issue to do with the sugar that was into the country, disappeared from government warehouses. These and many other cases that we continue reporting on a daily basis. Kenyans reading these on a daily basis. Now, as the president talked about inflation levels going down, that we are doing well in debt, that the economy has stabilized, but we are not really getting a firm, rather conviction that there is reasonable fight against corruption that is tangible, that Kenyans would say, finally, the government is fighting corruption. And even as the president addresses Kenyans in 60 years of independence, where are we in regards to 60 years of either winning fight against corruption or going down? And where do you sit? Are we doing better, or we just worsening by the day?
No, we are not. We're not doing better, and I say this because also we've seen, you know, certain cases that are currently ongoing. Some have been dropped in relation to corruption, but also there's no support or goodwill for individuals who stand up against corruption. I do feel that we need more political goodwill in terms of the individuals who are brave enough under service to come out and say, I'm seeing discrepancies and something needs to be done about it. What we have seen is individuals actually being scapegoated and being ostracized and put aside and threatened. And that needs to reduce, and that's how we will know if there's goodwill from the executive in regards to corruption. Additionally, what is a major concern is within the speeches, there's a lot of, we need to cut down on expenditure, but then the expenditure, you know, sometimes they try and argue that it's reduced, or they try and argue, you know, there was that huge debate about the travel to COP28, and they try to argue that the number of people representing the government is actually not more than 60, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done there. There's a lot of mismanagement of public resource, and we don't see enough heads roll when that mismanagement occurs in certain offices. Because even when we talk about dealing with debt, there has to be a way where, yes, we are accruing resources, but there also has to be where we are saving and reducing the costs that we are utilizing. And we haven't seen much of that. I believe that it's something that does have to come from the executive. We have seen previous presidents trying to use different methods in terms of even forming the EACC, and what does the EACC necessarily do? Moments like this, we have seen it very silent. Even if you are to submit certain cases toward them in terms of ethics and anti-corruption, do we see people being charged? Is it an institution that's actually independent and one that can actually stand on the basis of the Kenyan citizen? That is something that is debatable. That is something that we haven't seen them being active. Another thing that we haven't seen enough is declaration of public wealth. Public officials are supposed to be able to share, you know, where they're able to accrue that wealth, how they did it. That's there, but it's not as clear as it should be, because even within the constitution, public officials are not supposed to be engaged in private businesses, for instance. But we see the opposite in a lot of businesses in our country. Yes. Yeah. So I think that there are enough policies and laws that are very clear, but then we also see that it depends on which side you lie on whether a case will particularly get through to the courts or whether it will be dropped. So I do feel a lot more can be done in terms of corruption in our country.
And Kevin, Nerima raises pertinent questions here. It's a question of, we are fighting corruption as a country, and EACC is there to do its job. We have the 2010 constitution that put in place the chapter 6 of the constitution, but that has been mutilated over years by the National Assembly, and even recently there is a matter in the National Assembly that seeks to also interfere with the fight against corruption, according to what EACC says. And EACC for a very long time has equally demanded that they be given prosecutorial powers because they believe they can do a better job. This plus the fact that there is a feeling that the fight against corruption in this country has been politicized. 60 years later, Kevin, fight against corruption, tuko wapi?
60 years later, fight against corruption, confusing. Now, it is confusing because our president, a few days or months or weeks to his, in between the campaigns in June last year, he told us that in the event that he's elected president, he will not use his government as a tool for protecting corrupt individuals, and that government agencies would not be seen to be hunting public servants who are considered to be either corrupt or people who have issues and their faces are not as good to certain powers that be within government. 60 years down the line, and on the 2nd Jamhuri Day of Kenya Kwanza government is still confusing. That goodwill, in my view, is there, Dennis and Rima, but I think it is also confusing. Because one day the president will suspend a principal secretary, and in suspending that principal secretary, undertake a reshuffle for his government. But many months down the line, we do not know what happened. In between the scenario, we will be able to have a new DCI, we will be able to have a new DPP, we'll be able to have a new chair, in fact a bishop, to help us pray off corruption. But Kenyans continue to see corruption taking place in the bare minimum places where they engage with service delivery. Health facilities. Why don't our hospitals have primary healthcare needs like drugs? And so you are told, get pale, uende ununue dawa kule. So corruption, in my view, is not necessarily that national or that very grand, mega, big thing happening there. But I think for me, it is at the level where the common citizen feels disenfranchised to be able to get resources. So Kenya Kwanza government has not done very well, in my view. They've indicated a desire to want to fight corruption, and we saw it with the KEMSA process, the KEMSA case, and also the mosquito nets case. But beyond that, we still have a government where some of the people who have been accused of mega corruption issues sit in the cabinet. Yes, of course, we have been told this agency threw away the case. That case is no longer in existence. Where does that leave whistleblowers, people who see corruption taking place every day, but know nobody in government, but yet are much more concerned about the lack of monies to be able to render certain services? Dennis, 60 years down the line, and I think you mentioned it, we are grappling with putting together legislation that is going to support public servants to do business with government. It was never there. What has happened that certainly we consider, we think that public servants need to be given prime spaces in procurement processes. What has happened with conflict of interest? What has really dented our public procurement laws? So 60 years down the line, the war on corruption, confusing, because I think that initially in the past, we have made certain good progress. Kenyans were arresting police officers by the roadsides. Kenyans would say, sitakupa hongo, and there's nothing you do about it. Today, we see the failure of government agencies and institutions that are supposed to protect Kenyans and to deal with corruption, failing to speak to each other. Why would DCI officers get into some vehicle and hide, waiting to see a policeman picking 50 bob? Then we see the media taking videos of government officers running after each other over 50 bob. What has happened with interagency coordination between government agencies? I believe that a lot can be done. The president has told us that, for instance, he has increased judiciary fund, and that is expected to ensure that certain cases of corruption are dealt with within certain minimum timelines. We still do not have, 60 years down the line, the number of days a corruption case is supposed to be deliberated upon and disseminated. I mean, and to be discarded, having been dealt with. Someone is set free, found innocent, or you are jailed. We still see cases taking 6 years. Honestly, why? In the midst of judicial reforms that are taking place in our country, 60 years the line. Independence of commissions like Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, whether they get prosecutorial powers or they don't, status quo remaining the same, as long as Parliament fails to give them resources to be able to administer their responsibility, there is nothing we'll be doing. So yes, they can get their powers to arrest and prosecute, But if you do not have resources to be able to undertake investigations, people are going to appeal those cases, and government is going to be billed very heavily for arresting people who are considered innocent. So Article 49 of the Constitution comes in. So I think for me, we are on a right track in so far as processes that are being put to be able to prevent corruption, but a lot more still needs to be done, including public education. What is corruption? In my village where I am right now, the people call corruption mibadi. But that mibadi means a dirty thing that you do to someone. So if you abuse someone, would that be corruption? Why would somebody who has stolen a chicken and is feeling hungry, a young man walks into somebody's shamba and he takes some 2 sticks of sugar cane and is arrested and taken to the chief and is locked in and then taken to Madian where the police station is and is locked down for almost 6 months, for example, and someone has stolen hundreds of billions from Kenyans and is walking around and is campaigning to be governor of this county or that county. Where does that leave comparisons of grand, mega, minor, or major corruption scandals? So I think that Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission also needs to come out, and the bishop needs to work with this team to also help Kenyans understand what this corruption is, so that when we go out there to prevent, help us to also see what it would mean for government to protect a common Kenyan who has refused to give money to be able to benefit from government or public offices.
And I come to you, Nerima, now. Question on corruption is something that continues to hurt this country's economy on a daily basis. I mean, we find that it is stolen from us, stashed outside, and even getting that money back, it is gotten back with a lot of conditions. Because I'm aware that even when the government successfully wants to repatriate that money back, you're told we're not giving you in cash. We want you to go, we'll build a hospital with this money that was stolen from you. That is just how difficult it is. But as we summarize that, moving forward, to a Kenyan out there who says, if I am going to get my passport today, I'd rather pay 2,000 bob and get the process fast-tracked. How is that hurting them? Because if we don't speak to a Kenyan, they would not know what that means.
You see, so there's that you've reminded me of a very interesting situation that happened to a friend of mine, where it becomes foolish for a Kenyan to follow system, because following system is so slow, and following system doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get the outcome that you're pushing for. So what I'm trying to say is, in some situations, especially in Kenya, it's faster to facilitate processes.
It's actually called facilitation, yeah.
And there was even a paper that, Mutaingunyi did, and he wrote in the papers once, and he said, we just need to accept this and have court systems where there are levels that you can afford. So for 2,000 shillings, it will be done in a week. For 10,000, it will be done in 2 days. For 1 million, it will be done that same day, something like that. And it's an interesting debate, because our systems have become where you have to be able to know someone within for it to be processed fast enough. And we were hoping that when systems are digitized, that it removes that sense of someone is in charge, of someone is in control. Where if all our services, for instance, right now, government is talking about up to 7,000 services being digital on an application, that it's accessible to everybody. If they have a phone, they're able to put it on their app, upload their own account themselves, and request for a service through that system. And there's a time period that it's done, and you can pay for that system without having to see someone face to face, and it's done. But it's not as clear and as simply as that. We are still seeing situations where even when those systems exist, there are still individuals who are within who take advantage of the loopholes that still exist. So I would say, especially to the Kenyan young people, it's frustrating, because even there was the Youth Connect that happened this past weekend. So we're talking about 20,000 young people from different parts of Africa converging at KICC. And I had a young lady, Lillian, she actually walked up to me and she said, I've finished Form 4. I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. I'm the firstborn in a family of 3, but I'm looking for a job opportunity. And I know in our country, it's about who you know.
Yeah.
And it's not about the kind of education that I have or my hard work. It doesn't matter. I don't know anybody. I saw this summit being advertised, and I signed up, and I have come. And my job is actually just to network and find opportunities here. So it's concerning that, 60 years on, that a young person who is the builder of a nation, it's the young people who are going to take this country over to the next 60 years. And, when you think about the first speech that was given by Jomo Kenyatta, and he was saying, we're fighting ignorance, disease, and poverty. We're still fighting ignorance, disease, and poverty.
Yeah.
And even to see that the young person, I can't imagine in 63 how it was to see the Kenyan flag go up for the first time. That jubilation, joy, and finally thinking we have control of our lives and we can make something out of it. Fast forward to today, I don't see the same jubilation. And I say this because growing up, I remember seeing, flags. It's a holiday.
Yeah.
You would see the way they've decorated even the CBD. The flag of Kenya is everywhere. The flag of, city council is everywhere. You just knew tomorrow is a holiday. In fact, even most of the shops were closed. Yesterday, my friends were working. They worked. And that's why I'm saying it didn't really feel like 60 years. And so when you see that the most pressing issue for a young person is opportunity, they will pay that 2,000. And that's how we have so many cases of people being, conned, paying up to 250,000, selling property, money they don't have, having family members contribute just to send that one young person in their family somewhere who will make a difference for us. And that is a worrying situation at 60. So I think that, any government, the one now, is going to be worried about what's going to happen to our youth as they get younger, because the population is actually getting younger. And if they wake up to the fact that there are no opportunities for us, that frankly is a very scary ticking time bomb, if nothing is done about it expeditiously.
Kevin, Niruma raises the question of a young person who's sad, and I want to expound that and just ask, 60 years later, 52 million Kenyans, are we a happy society? Are we happy to be Kenyans? And if not, what must this government do to make sure that when that young person comes for the Youth Connect Summit, is out there ready to learn with the hope that the government will give them with the arsenal they need to get out there to be able to deliver for themselves and for their families? Are we happy, Osido? And if not, what must we all do together? Because this is a unified approach. What must we do for us to be happy in the years to come?
Are we happy? And reminds me of the president speaking yesterday, and he was mentioning Singapore, Malaysia, and then some other countries. And I asked myself, but 60 years down the line, these countries were like us. What has happened that now most young Kenyans are looking for opportunities to go closer to Southeast Asia and become more happier. You go to Singapore, systems work, but it is because their founding fathers, their leaders, people like Dr. Lee Kuan Yew, made deliberate choices. And I have been to Singapore a number of times, and in that country, you don't wait for anyone to do anything for you. So that, for example, part of the reasons why Singaporeans are much more happier than Kenyans is because education is working for them. The government underscores what are the mega sectors to drive the economy, and they invest in those sectors. For example, education. Education is free, and government is investing heavily to be able to empower the young people of Singapore through education and then pump them into the manufacturing sector. So industrialization then is faring in that country and others around there because government has identified a gap that it wants to fill. Come back home, we change our curriculum of education. For every government term, something new is happening in the education sector. Either we are painting our buses yellow, or a CS who does not like yellow because yellow looks like green to me, decides that they must be painted blue. And we are not so sure about whether it is junior secondary or junior primary secondary, then primary. So we have primarians going to the same school with high schoolers. It's confusing, Dennis. 60 years down the line, it is confusing. So in that confusion, I don't think a majority of Kenyans are happy. And that is why, look at, for example, what was in Gishu. The number of parents who will do anything to ensure that their children get scholarships to go and study outside this country. It is because of frustration. And I don't think whether we can juxtapose frustration and happiness. So it therefore means that 60 years down the line, in our happiness index, we are not doing very well as a country. We are not doing very well because food security is also not working. We are still confused, Dennis, 60 years down the line, whether it is El Nino or it is high rains or low rains. One agency is saying it is El Nino. It is confusing. So how are farmers supposed to plan for their agricultural productivity? It's still confusing whether that manure has been brought for free by a certain government or it is the reagents. So our government is supposed to work with our industrialization agencies locally to produce manure, which is then, or rather fertilizer, which is then supposed to be given to farmers for free. It is still confusing. So in that confusion, there is really limited or no happiness. So our level of happiness as a society depends on how much money therefore you have, and especially for young people who in government. But even today, the who in government is sometimes not working for even those who know someone in government. Because the system has been made so difficult that the person that in government must also know somebody who knows somebody who has the password for the job that you're looking for. So the happiness level, therefore, is also confusing. We don't know whether to be happy because I know my uncle who works for XYZ government agency, when he or she says, when he says as an uncle or an auntie, she says, nitakupa hiyo kazi. Am I supposed to go home smiling? Or tomorrow atasema, oh pole, ule jamaa hajapokea simu, bado yako mteja, ameenda conference Dubai. It's confusing. And I think that a lot of things therefore dent our levels of patriotism. And I agree with Nerima that when you are growing up, you could see that level of patriotism in Kenyans, where you'd even be told, kesho tutapika chapati sababu ni holiday. And you'd even be told, please tafuta kiatu kizuri uvae sababu tutaenda stadium. And shops would be closed. You would see even kids making their own small Kenyan flags, this protege of a flag that will be waving even to a district commissioner. Those days. Yeah. But today, people don't feel it. In fact, in some of the places I visited on my way to Vihiga yesterday, people are just watching soccer. You would see local schools with young people flooded. They don't care about what the president is talking about. They are busy with their local leagues. They are busy with their local teams. Whether they will benefit from Talanta Hela or they will get something from the county department of sports, it is not their business. They are trying to get some level of happiness by scoring certain goals to this team, and they're jubilating, and they find their own ways of being happy. That, I think, has been dented by the inability of our systems locally to enhance the spirit of patriotism, indeed, which is espoused in our national values and principles in Article 6, in Chapter 6 and Article 10 of our Constitution. And therefore, Dennis, I wish to ask that we enhance intergenerational dialogues, where the 60 years today, those who were born 60 years ago, let government support dialogues in town halls, in whatever mechanisms of conversations, where young people would sit with their elders and just go back 60 years ago and ask ourselves, what is the difference? What has changed? What is it that we are doing well? What is it that we are not doing very well? I sometimes hope that when I become president, instead of flooding people at Uru Gardens or somewhere in Kinoru Stadium, I would just ask people, the way we decided that a national holiday, who told you that tomorrow, Monday, we are going to plant trees? So why don't we also have a national holiday for intergenerational dialogue, where we ask the elders in the villages, sit with your young ones, help them think through patriotism, how can we be able to make systems better, and then make those proposals meaningful. Like what we see in public participation, people sit, they decide that we want boreholes here. When the county government or the government comes up ultimately with a report, they say they wanted lorries to go and transport, water or water boozers or whatever. So let that conversation also have some meaningful to people, and that will begin to get back Kenyans' interest into their country.
Yes, Kevin.
Those who are in diaspora would also want to engage through Zoom or Teams like I'm currently doing, and just talk to their young people, what they see happening in those countries out there in the diaspora, and how we can be able to begin the conversation of spurring young people to make this country a better place. So I think that as I said, again, it's confusing because we are making certain steps, very good steps forwards, but several other steps backwards. And that is why, and Nerima knows this, that a research that was carried some time back by some local university, for a number of young people who are interviewed, they said, I would rather give a bribe to get a job, because that is what they see working. They see the wash people coming out and running as MPs, MCAs, governors, senators, they get elected. They see people who are evil, doing terrible things in the society, rising their way upwards. And they feel that that is the best way for them to be able to get jobs. So I empathize with Lillian that Nerima spoke to, but that story is the same story for as many young people in the many corners of Kenya.
In the country.
Young people who are really striving every day. They are looking for opportunities, but those opportunities are not there. Even those who are innovating, government policies, systems, legislations have not been able to support them to be able to be as innovative. We have not seen value chain processing for what young people are coming up with locally and being supported by government, even to sell their ideas to the outside world, as we see in other countries like the ones that the president was telling us about yesterday. Malaysia, it's different. You go to universities.
And Kevin, you raise very fundamental questions. I'll give you my personal story growing up. I remember during these holidays, my old man would take me in Eldoret to Eldoret Stadium, and would always wave these flags. Would always dress nice to see the PC during those days. And whenever the flag would go up, we would stand and wait for the flag to be raised. Do you know the loyalty pledge? Can you sing the loyalty pledge?
I can't remember it.
Exactly, but back in the days, we
were
being asked to do these things because then we were proud to be Kenyans, and we were happy to be there. But now, today, it is a sad story that in terms of patriotism, and people seem to be focusing on other things that will give them happiness. How I wish that the government would make us happy and smile and say the government is working for us. But now, 42 billion shillings amount of money lent to 21 million Hustler Fund borrowers, making it the largest financial inclusion program in the country. Nerima, you deal with the young people on a daily basis. This Hustler Fund, pretty much even on how it's been structured, is meant to help the young people, those SMEs that are coming up. What is your view on the Hustler Fund out there? How many people that you deal on a daily basis have actually benefited from this?
I know people who applied to the Hustler Fund and received the fund and returned it, but they haven't been utilizing it for their small businesses. I personally don't know anyone, but I know that the president has also mentioned on multiple occasions that even with the Hustler Fund, there's been 2 billion in terms of savings. So I do think that it's working for some people. I wouldn't completely negate it, but also it's very difficult to even run a business in our country. You know, even for me who runs, and even Kevin does, I mean, we can talk about how difficult it has also become just because of the economic situation, which is also happening globally. So there is a need, definitely a need, for young people to have access to resource, because we cannot have young people depending on banks. You do not have the credit, even the access to be able to build it, for a bank to be able to loan you the resource, and the interest rates are too high. So the only options a lot of young people would have is a SACCO, and now the Hustler Fund is another alternative. I do not know, in terms of building the economy, how much it would contribute. I wish that we would have clearer data in terms of this is how much it has been able to boost our economy, this is how many young people have plugged into the economy. So a lot of times we see a lot of feedback in terms of how much money has been lent, how much money a lot of young people have received. But then I would like to hear more details on these are the kind of businesses that it has gone toward. These are the number of people who now have received an opportunity or are now hired because of the Hustler Fund, because of these opportunities. Because it's going to be very difficult for government to produce all opportunities. It's not possible. In the beginning of the conversation, I shared there are just too many young people. December, another month, a lot of students are going to graduate. We're talking about 1 million that graduate annually, and they're looking for opportunities. So it's not going to be possible for the government to create enough jobs for everybody. So whether we like it or not, some young people are going to have to create opportunities for themselves and for their peers. And so we do need avenues for them to be able to get resource. But then I do think that a lot needs to be done in terms of the data and the accountability, in terms of how the resources are being utilized, and also understanding whether there are procurement challenges, because we've seen entities such as AGPO also not being utilized to the maximum. We've also seen challenges of young people accessing that resource, and people within their families taking advantage of young people in terms of utilizing their name and identity to ask for resource, but not actually having access to that resource. So it's the same thing happening in Hustler Fund. I think a lot of times we hear a lot of the positive ends, and I'm sure that there are some challenges within it that are not publicly shared as much as I would like to know more about the Hustler Fund.
And just remember, when I come back, we're going for a short commercial break. Kevin, I'll be coming to you on Hustler Fund to just know who's the custodian of these money. I mean, when you come back after this break, we try to ask these questions and maybe even seek for the accountability and openness, transparency that is required. But all that on Morning Prime after this break.